Morning light slid gently through the sheer curtains of the Bennett townhouse, painting the kitchen in strokes of gold. The city outside still stirred itself awake. The muted hum of early traffic, a dog's distant bark, the hiss of a passing bus. Inside, everything was still. Too still. Amara Bennett stood by the counter, her hands resting lightly on the marble surface she'd once chosen with such care. The kitchen had always been her favorite room. An open, sunlit space, all glass and natural wood, a quiet testimony to the kind of design she loved. Minimal, intentional, and full of air. It had always felt alive. But today, it felt hollow, like the air had forgotten how to move. Behind her, the coffee machine clicked, exhaled a slow sigh of steam and fell silent. Ethan Caldwell's mug waited beside it, white porcelain, monogrammed in gold, his initials, EC, gleaming in the light. Amara glanced at the clock. 7:12 a.m. He was never late. Ethan was the kind of man who believed that time, like everything else, could be managed. When he finally entered the kitchen, his presence filled the space in that way it always had, quiet but commanding. Even in a gray morning suit, he looked like he'd stepped out of an ad campaign for American Ambition. Tall, clean-cut, every detail deliberate. The kind of man who walked into a room and rearranged the energy without saying a word. Except today, his eyes wouldn't meet hers. "Good morning," she said softly, as though the word itself might break. He gave a faint nod, his hands tucked into his pockets. "Amara, we should talk." That sentence, the one that arrives like a blade, hung between them. We should talk. She'd felt something coming for months. The quiet distance, the missed dinners, the careful excuses that sounded almost rehearsed. But she'd convinced herself it was stress, the new project, the constant pressure of New York's skyline to outdo itself. Ethan was a developer, and ambition was his oxygen. Still, some part of her, the part that built things, believed that foundations, once laid, were meant to last. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice calm but thin. "Is it about the proposal in Brooklyn? Because if you just let me..." "It's not about work." His tone was measured, practiced. "It's about us." He took a slow breath, the kind men take before detonating something irreversible. "I've been thinking about this for a long time, Amara, and I can't keep pretending. I've met someone." The words struck without sound. For a heartbeat, she didn't move, didn't breathe. The city outside continued its rhythm, unaware that inside this glass-walled kitchen, an entire world had just tilted off its axis. She blinked once, twice. "You've met someone?" His jaw tightened. "Her name's Chloe. She works in design consulting. She understands what I'm trying to build, where I'm trying to go. She understands what I'm trying to build." It was a strange phrase to use with an architect. Amara's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her mind flickered with images. The nights she'd stayed up editing his proposals, reworking his layouts, making sure every line and shadow fit together. The home she'd designed for them. The studio she'd built so he could think clearly. The very life he was now walking away from had been her blueprint. And now he was leaving. Not with rage, not even with cruelty, but with the calm efficiency of a man signing off a completed project. "How long?" she finally whispered. 6 months, he said. "Maybe 7. She laughed, quietly, incredulously. The kind of laugh that doesn't belong to joy but disbelief. "So when we celebrated our anniversary in Paris..." "It was already over," he said. "You just didn't see it yet." Amara felt her throat tighten, her pulse in her ears. She wanted to shout, to throw the coffee mug, to demand how he could dismantle 10 years so easily. But instead she stood very still, every ounce of her composure balanced on the edge of ruin. "Why today?" she asked. "Why tell me now?" He looked at her for the first time then, and in his eyes she saw not malice but cowardice, the kind that hides behind timing. "Because you deserve the truth," he said, "and because I can't lie to you anymore." The irony burned. Truth from the man who had been lying for months. When he turned to leave, she didn't stop him. The door closed softly behind him, and the silence that followed was not peaceful. It was absolute. Amara stood motionless in the sunlight, staring at the steam curling from the untouched coffee. For 10 years she had been the architect of their life, Every decision, every compromise, every sacrifice measured and placed like stone upon stone. Now she realized she had been building on borrowed ground. She pressed a hand against the countertop to steady herself. Her engagement ring caught the light, an unintentional reflection that flashed like a signal flare and then faded. In that brief glint, she understood something painful and liberating. She had spent a decade designing someone else's empire while quietly demolishing her own. The morning stretched out around her, vast and empty. Outside, sunlight spilled across the city she'd helped design, the city that would keep standing, indifferent to heartbreak. And somewhere in that thought, buried beneath the ache and the betrayal, a whisper began to take shape. It wasn't strength yet, not hope, just a quiet question. What if I build again? If you felt the tremor in this story, that quiet moment where something breaks so something new can begin, let your heart linger here a while. Tell me what it stirred in you. Leave your thoughts below. Share this with someone who's learning to rebuild, and follow the channel for the next chapter. Because the story of Amara Bennett is only beginning, and what comes next will rise higher than anything she's ever built before. The evening that had been meant to mark a decade of joined lives dissolved before nightfall. Not with a shout, but with a perfectly composed image and a caption that read like a verdict. Amara first learned of the cancellation by the way other people's calendars shifted. Her phone vibrated with tentative messages, friends checking in, assistants asking about last-minute changes, each ping a small echo of the same question that had not yet been asked aloud. Are you all right? She assumed Ethan, in some flurry of regret or poor judgment, had called. She assumed because hope is a habit. It is what architects build when they cannot bear the thought of collapse. There was no flurry. There was a post. The notification arrived as a soft rectangle on her screen, a mechanical promise of connection that now felt like a blade. Ethan's account, always polished, curated, a portrait of success in warm tones, had a new image. He and a blonde woman stood beneath the arched entrance of a boutique hotel, wine glasses raised, smiles practiced in the way public affection is practiced. The photograph glittered with the light of professional lenses and social ease. She knew the set, neutral palette, a hint of hotel glamour, the kind of place he would choose for a staged romance. His caption read, "New beginnings, grateful for the people who understand my vision, excited for what's next." The words were ordinary, sterile, and as they scrolled past her eyes, they rearranged themselves into accusation. The woman in the picture, Chloe Martin, had the kind of beauty that reads well in pixels. Porcelain skin, hair, honey brushed to an almost luminous blonde, an effortless, candid laugh that looked designed to be shared. Her arm looped around his waist in a gesture that said, "I belong in his frame." The comment thread bloomed like a garden of polite thorns. Congratulations, well wishes, discreet envy. Friends of both of them offered the perfunctory likes, hearts, and party emojis. Industry contacts dropped in remarks about power couples and shared aesthetics. People who had always occupied the periphery of their lives now performed loyalty to the narrative that he had posted. Amara watched as faces she had known for years added their stamps of approval. Each heart felt like a nail being hammered into the lid of the coffin that had been her private life. Her hand tightened around the phone until her knuckles whitened. She remembered assembling the guest list for the anniversary, the curator who had chosen dinner music, the colleague who always brought a bottle of rare bourbon, the small details she had spent weeks smoothing like pressed linen. She had imagined evenings of laughter and the quiet pride of two people who had built something together. Instead, the image on his screen turned those plans into an exhibit of absence. She tried calling him once, twice. The calls went to voicemail, each one a small, anticlimactic surrender. Later she replayed his voice, flat, rehearsed, the same cadence that had announced his intentions in the kitchen. The man who could make decisions like blueprints. She listened to the message and heard not apology, but explanation. Logistics, timing, arrangements for the guest list, notes on scheduling. He spoke as if emotion were a calendar item. By noon, the story had 1,000 faces. Someone from the office, one of Ethan's junior associates, sent her a screenshot of a terse email he'd circulated, an attempt at corporate housekeeping. Due to a family emergency, tonight's event is postponed. Please hold any further public comments. The message was sterile and efficient. To him, crisis management was a rubric. To her, it was the public folding of a life. Gossip, sharp as winter wind, moved faster than she could follow. Texts arrived with the diffident intimacy of condolence and the pointed sting of performance. "I'm so sorry, Amara," read one. "OMG saw the post, had no idea," read another. "If you need anything, call me," read a third from a woman who had, only months before, toasted their home at a catered party. The warmth of some messages simmered into the curiosity of others who had always enjoyed proximity to scandal. The ghastliest part was the slow, inevitable editing of her story. People rearranged memories in ways that required no malice, only the pliable nature of narrative. At a cocktail party, she had once stood beside Ethan while he answered questions about the Lakeside project. In retellings, she had been his companion, not his co-designer. A feature in a glossy magazine had once shown him in the living room she had drawn. In editorial captions, his name was the byline that mattered. The web of attribution unspooled, and she watched it unravel in public. She considered for a fledgling second responding, posting a photo of the plans she had drafted for their home. The sketches with her looping handwriting, the renderings that bore her stamp in every angle of light. But the thought of claiming space on the same feed that had been turned into his stage felt small and reactive. She had always been better than petty replies. The architect in her recoiled at the idea of constructing an answer that would be framed by his terms. Instead, she did something quieter and, in its way, more decisive. She vanished. Not in the dramatic sense of disappearing, rather she withdrew, a controlled retreat. She closed her accounts, deactivated, muted, the digital equivalent of drawing the shades. Her phone, for the first time in years, felt like a foreign object in her palm, a tool that once served a life of meetings and messages, and now only broadcasted the echo of abandonment. She shut it away in a drawer, beneath swatches of fabric and a small box of architect's pencils, all the implements of a life that had been both public and private. In the hollowness that followed the online storm, the townhouse seemed to gather its breath. The space she had shaped, soft woods, generous windows, carefully chosen ceramics, came back to her as if in a double exposure. The home she had built and the life she had lost. The city's distant murmur became a kind of achromatic music, underscoring the private disaster that did not make the evening news but felt, to her, like the end of something monumental. Her friends called, some pressing for answers, others offering silences. Naomi, her sister, left messages with a directness that suited her. No platitudes, only promises of arrival. Amara turned over each voicemail like a page, not yet ready to read. For a long time she lay awake on the couch, staring at the ceiling as if it might reveal a plan scrawled in its plaster. When sleep finally came, it did so in short, disjointed fragments. Dreams rose as architectural metaphors, skylines that crumbled into sand, staircases that led back to the same closed door, an auditorium filling and then emptying as if on cue. She woke with the image of Chloe's smile echoing inside the hollow of her chest, a smile that now occupied space Amara had once thought entirely her own. Morning came, indifferent and precise. The city resumed its business of being itself, indifferent to heartbreak, insensitive in its constancy. Amara moved through the room she had designed with a new attentiveness, tracing with her fingertips the joints and seams, the places where two planes met and held. In those small inspections there lived a nascent curiosity, not yet hope, not yet courage, but the raw attention of someone surveying the damage. The public collapse had clipped the flags in her life, but it had not, she discovered, taken the plans beneath her hands. The house held its breath in those days between the storm and whatever would come next. Light moved across the parquet as if testing the grain. Rooms remembered the shape of conversation and found, in its absence, that their echoes had a punctuation all their own. Amara learned in slow and exacting increments how loneliness could feel like a material, weighty, tactile, and how, like any material, it could be studied, measured, and eventually understood. She kept the apartment as she had always kept it. not in defiance of the change, but as an act of fidelity to herself. A vase of late tulips stood guard on the kitchen island, their petals closed against the chill. Her drafting table was dusted but ready, a faithful plane of possibility. She moved through the rooms with a kind of professional curiosity, cataloging the small betrayals, the way an urban planner might walk a block and note where a sidewalk had become uneven. Each misaligned tile, each loose thread on the favorite chair, each overlooked detail suggested a story, one she had been living without noticing. Mornings arrived with an awkward civility. She made tea, not coffee, the loose leaves steeping in a slow, fragrant bloom that filled the kitchen and softened the edges of thought. Tea required patience. Coffee demanded immediate action. The choice was deliberate. She brewed it in a glass pot she had found in a market in Marrakesh years earlier, a memory of a younger self who believed in journeys more than destinations. She wrapped her hands around the warmth and watched the steam rise like a pale map of an unknown route. Sleep, when it came, was frayed. Dreams were architectural, corridors that led to rooms she had never built, skylights that closed as she reached for the sun, staircases that looped back on themselves. She woke with the imprint of blueprints on her mind and the resounding absence of a voice that had once narrated so many decisions. At first, the silence felt like a betrayal. Then it felt, curiously, like permission. She combed her shelves, pulling down books she had not opened in years, treatises on urban resiliency, slim monographs of women architects whose names were whispered with reverence in faculty lounges. The author's sentences read differently now, as if they had always been speaking directly to her, and she had only just learned to listen. In margins, she found annotations, tiny notes written in her younger handwriting, ideas clipped from conferences, an address scribbled for a panel she had intended to attend. These marginalia were small fossilized proofs that she had once been unabashed in her wanting. Friends came and went in cautious shifts. Some entered the apartment with a practiced cheer, as if to prove that ordinary life could still be hosted within the broken frame of another's history. Others sat in companionable quiet, their presence more like an oak column supporting a weary roof. A few condolences were clumsy, platitudes that stacked like cheap bricks. The ones that mattered, an unexpected loaf of bread left at the door, a handwritten note slid beneath the front mat, a text that read simply, "I'm here," were the ones that felt like real materials to rebuild with. She read the articles she had avoided like surgical reports, only letting her gaze skim the headlines at first. His interview with the local paper, polished, strategic, rearranged the space between them as if the story of their life could be edited like a press release. He spoke of growth and divergence, of two people outgrowing the same frame. He made it sound inevitable and tidy. She was struck not by anger at his words alone, but by the ease with which the world accepted them. Attribution, she realized with a cold clarity, is a public craft. The city tells itself stories and chooses which names to engrave on stone. There were afternoons she walked without destination, letting the geometry of the streets absorb and redirect the noise in her skull. She watched how light fractured off glass facades and how pigeons found absolute comfort on ledges that she had once designed in theory only. The city was both indifferent and intimate. It refused to collate her sorrow into a neat narrative, instead offering itself raw and ongoing. On a bench in a small park, she would sit and sketch, quick, anonymous gestures at first, lines that were more about returning the hand to its practiced motion than producing anything showable. The motion steadied a pulse that had been racing. It was a private ritual of repair. At night, she found herself drawing back to the study, to the archive of her work. Folders with client notes, renderings with her signature loops, project proposals stamped with deadlines. For years, she had suppressed the small triumphs for the sake of partnership. There were pages where her name did appear, rarely and often in fine print. She read those pages the way one reads a letter from a former lover, searching between lines for the proof of one's former grandeur. Those proofs were there, modest but undeniable. She had built more than she had admitted to herself. In the loneliness, thoughts began to rearrange themselves. The rage that had once felt like a sudden thunderstorm settled into a slow, clarifying rain. She started to notice how often she had deferred, to soften her edges, to be companionable, to make collaboration comfortable for a partner who thrived on being the loudest voice in a room. The realization was not an accusation at first, but an inventory. Each sacrifice cataloged itself: a declined lecture, a shelved solo project, a professional silence kept for the sake of domestic peace. The ledger was long. The weight was real. And yet, within that list of concessions, a subtle ember glowed. It was a memory of an earlier ambition, of layouts drawn in blackout hours, of nights where exhilaration replaced exhaustion because a concept had finally aligned. That ember was not loud. It did not demand immediate action. It only reminded her, gently and insistently, that she had been an originator, a maker of spaces that have always outlived their creators. By the end of the week, she found herself opening an old portfolio, the kind bound in soft leather, its spine creased where it had been carried to countless meetings. She spread the pages on the dining table like a diplomat spreading maps. The renderings, some dusty, some still crisp, held the smell of past sites: fresh paint, sawdust, coffee. She let her fingers follow the lines she had drawn years ago. There, in ink and shade, were the choices she had made, the conclusions she had engineered. They were not merely technical feats, they were declarations. Outside, the city continued to build and dismantle without pause. Inside, Amara began, with the quiet method of someone who knows structures intimately, to take inventory, not of what was lost, but of what remained. It was, she discovered, a different kind of blueprint, not one that guaranteed the outcome, but one that honored the materials at hand: her knowledge, her craft, the small, faithful community that had not abandoned her. The quiet aftermath, she realized, was not a place of defeat. It was the first clean, honest room in which she could stand and, with tools redistributed and eyes clearer, start to draft the edges of what would come after. Naomi arrived on a Sunday afternoon, stepping into the apartment as if she were crossing into a courtroom she already understood. She didn't knock twice. She never did. The air around her seemed charged with that familiar, quicksilver blend of concern and authority that came naturally to a woman who'd spent her life arguing for justice. Amara heard the door open, the soft thud of a suitcase against the hallway wall, and then her sister's voice, clear and steady. "You didn't answer any of my calls." "I didn't have words," Amara said quietly from the kitchen, where she stood over an untouched pot of soup. The aroma of thyme and onions lingered in the air, domestic but hollow. Naomi set her bag down, shrugged off her coat, and took in the space. The unwashed cup on the counter, the curtains half drawn, the stillness that had settled like dust. "You never need words with me," she said. "You just need to open the door." The sisters looked at each other for a long moment, one in immaculate black slacks and a linen shirt, freshly pressed from the flight. The other in a faded sweater, her curls tied back in a loose, uncertain knot. They had the same eyes, though, dark and lucid, the color of steady resolve. Naomi crossed the room and pulled Amara into her arms. It wasn't the kind of embrace meant to soothe. It was grounding, like someone driving a stake into the earth to remind you where you stand. "I saw the article," Naomi said when they finally separated, "and the post, and the spectacle." She sighed. "I don't even know which part angers me most, that he humiliated you publicly, or that you're still protecting him by saying nothing." Amara sank into a chair, tracing the rim of her teacup. "There's nothing to say. The whole city already believes his version. The man who outgrew his wife." Her voice cracked slightly around the word. "If I speak, I sound bitter. If I'm silent, I look broken. Either way, I lose." Naomi leaned against the counter, folding her arms. "You don't lose by refusing to play his game, but you lose by disappearing from your own story." Amara looked up at her. "Naomi, you make it sound easy. You've always been good at fighting back." "I'm good at fighting," Naomi corrected, her expression softening. "But that doesn't mean it's easy. It means I learned where the bruises go." She walked toward the window, parting the curtain with a sharp tug. "Do you remember when you first came to New York? You called me after your first presentation. You were terrified. I was 22 and presenting to a board of men twice my age. And you still own that room, Naomi said. I remember because you told me your voice was shaking so badly you thought they could see your heartbeat. But you did it anyway. You didn't need permission then. What happened? Amara exhaled slowly. Ethan happened. Partnership happened. Compromise happened. One day you decide to make room for someone else, and then suddenly there's no room left for you. Naomi's tone softened, but her words stayed sharp. That's not partnership, baby. That's absorption, and I'm not here to watch you dissolve. Amara let the words settle. The truth of them stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were precise. Naomi had always known how to cut to the center of things, to make truth sound like rescue. Naomi turned toward her sister. You need to build again. Not for him, not for revenge. For yourself. For the woman who once drafted blueprints at 2 in the morning because an idea refused to let her sleep. Amara shook her head, a sad smile flickering. I don't even know where to start. Start small, Naomi said. Start where you left off. Show the world and yourself that you're still the architect of your own story. For a while, neither spoke. The quiet between them was thick. Not awkward, but meaningful, like the pause between a breath and its exhale. The city hummed outside. Taxis, voices, the faint thrum of music from a passing car. Naomi moved to the bookshelf, running her fingers along the spines. You've always had too much grace for your own good, she murmured. You mistake silence for dignity. Sometimes it's just another way of bleeding quietly. The words landed softly, but with weight. Amara turned toward her sister, something shifting behind her eyes. A flicker, small but undeniable. And what would you have me do? She asked, almost daring her. Naomi smiled, that fierce, familiar smile that could win cases and bend rooms. I'd have you remember who you are. The woman who designed half this skyline while letting someone else sign the contracts. The woman who could look at a pile of rubble and already see the lines of a new foundation. Amara wanted to argue, to explain that exhaustion was heavier than inspiration, that grief didn't vanish on command. But instead she found herself listening, because Naomi's voice, measured and steady, had always carried the sound of inevitability. The voice that didn't just offer belief but demanded it. You know what I did after my divorce? Naomi continued, taking a seat across from her. I started running every morning. I hated running, but I needed to feel my body moving forward, even if my heart hadn't caught up yet. You don't heal by standing still, Amara. You heal by motion. Amara's hands tightened around her cup. And if I fall, then you'll fall forward, Naomi said simply. That's the point. A silence followed. Not heavy this time, but ripe with unspoken recognition. The kind of silence shared between sisters who have lived through the same storms in different seasons. Later, when Naomi had gone to bed, Amara lingered by the window. The city stretched out before her, infinite and unapologetic. Glass towers shimmered like promises kept. Somewhere below, a train passed, its sound rolling through the night like breath. She thought of Naomi's words, absorption, motion, foundation, and felt them settle into the architecture of her thoughts. They fit together, forming something that resembled both a challenge and a blueprint. In the reflection of the glass, Amara caught her own gaze. Steady, a little tired, but awake in a way she hadn't been for weeks. She realized with a quiet sort of awe that the collapse had stopped. The debris had settled. And beneath it, somewhere deep, there was ground firm enough to build on again. Amara reopened the laptop with a nervous sort of reverence, as if unsealing a letter from a life she had once written in longhand. The homepage she'd built years ago greeted her with a portrait of a skyline she scarcely remembered wanting then. Beneath it, thumbnails of projects, some credited properly, some footnoted in a way that made her chest ache. She ran her fingers over the trackpad and felt the faint, familiar hum of a tool that had once been an extension of her hand. Naomi sat beside her with a cup of tea, eyes steady, the kind of companion who knew when to observe and when to push. We'll start with the bio, she said simply. Put your name first. Not Amara, wife and partner. Amara Bennett, architect, urbanist, maker. Amara smiled at the correction and felt a small, private lightness at the sound of her own name unsoftened. Names mattered. Credits did too. She typed, slow and deliberate, Amara Bennett, urban planner and sustainability architect, focused on resilient public spaces that prioritize community and memory. The words felt like the first clean brick laid in a foundation that had been cleared of rubble. They sifted through files that afternoon, PDFs, old emails, scans of hand-rendered sketches. Dust motes turned in the sunlight like tiny planets. There was a tenderness to the work, the rediscovery of a hand once bold with line weight and conviction. Amara found a folder labeled Bronx Prospect, Initial Study. She had almost forgotten it, the project that had existed more as a whisper than an assignment. A community center built from reclaimed timber and salvaged brick, a porous building that invited the neighborhood into its belly rather than standing aloof as a trophy of development. She had drawn it late one winter night after a lecture, caught in a moment of yearning for architecture that healed. She spread the renderings across the dining table like sacred maps. The paper smelled faintly of the spray fixative in coffee, a smell that felt like home. There were watercolor washes that softened the hard lines, charcoal marks where she had explored shadows, and annotations in the margins. Notes about passive cooling, skylights oriented to capture low-angled winter sun, rain gardens to catch runoff, and feed planters that would feed a small rooftop farm. Each annotation read like a promise. Gathering hall, after-school studio, micro-enterprise stalls. Naomi traced a finger over a plan where Amara had proposed folding seating into the amphitheater steps so that weekend performances could be both intimate and communal. "You always love the small gestures," Naomi said. "Little ideas that make a public place feel like home." Amara laughed, a sound that surprised her with its honesty. "I used to climb onto scaffolding just to see how people would sit on a curb," she said. "I would watch the way parents balance grocery bags and toddlers and try to imagine a ledge that would cradle both." They worked through the afternoon, and with every page, Amara felt the old cadence of her mind return. Problem, constraint, elegant solution. It wasn't that she'd been robbed of talent. It had been borrowed by the logistics of partnership and the slow accretion of other people's names. Now, unmoored, the drafts reopened like a ledger of what she had always been capable of creating. When evening came, the city's own architecture, brick, glass, and the distant silhouette of water towers took on the softened glow of her sketches. The bronze light spilled across the paper and made the ink shimmer. In that light, Amara allowed herself to imagine the Bronx project not as a wish, but as a thing that could be realized. The center would be a hinge between generations, where elders could teach traditional crafts under awnings that sheltered summer rain, where teenagers could learn digital fabrication alongside gardening, where a corner could host a pop-up clinic for civic forms and voter registration. She saw, suddenly and fully, a building as a kind of civic heart. She didn't romanticize the labor. There would be community meetings and permitting navies to navigate. There would be fundraising dinners where she would try not to sound like a woman who had once been silenced. But the work itself, drawing the roofline just so, considering how the flank of the building might catch the late sun and throw warm light into the gathering hall, felt like a return to the only honest kind of romance she'd known, the one between maker and making. Naomi, meanwhile, drafted a short note, professional, succinct, to go with the portfolio update. "We'll put up the Bronx concept as a study," she said. "Make it clear it's authored by you. People need to see your thinking." She typed, then softened the language where Amara's hand had once been generous to others. "Design authored by Amara Bennett. Conceptual development and community engagement strategy available upon request **." There were small victories. The placement of her name in headers, the unambiguous credit line beneath renderings, the decision to include the working drawings rather than the glossy, airbrushed photographs that had been cropped by other narratives. The website began to feel less like a resume and more like a manifesto. Later, alone, Amara returned to the dining table and took up a blank sheet of vellum. The first lines she drew were tentative, a pencil finding its bearings. Then, as if a ghost of muscle memory guided her wrist, the strokes grew confident and clean. She sketched the building's entry, a low threshold folded outward like an invitation. She drew the community garden beds, a stepped green ribbon catching rainwater, and a folding facade that could open in summer to let the street breathe into the hall. Ink followed pencil. The lines became weight and shadow. She shaded the amphitheater steps until they looked like possible seats for people whose laughter would fill the courtyard. When the drawing was finished, at least for the night, she sat back and let the room inhale. The city beyond the windows blinked its streetlights on. In the hush that pressed gently against the glass, Amara felt the first true uncoiling of desire since the collapse. An appetite not for revenge, but for making, for the slow and relentless art of constructing places that could hold life's mess in its music. She arranged the renderings in a neat stack, closed the laptop, and for the first time in weeks, left the apartment with a sketch tucked under her arm. She walked the avenues with the weight of the paper against her ribs, each step quiet and deliberate, as though footprints themselves might lay out a path from ruin to possibility. The first blueprint, she realized, was not only a plan on paper, it was the beginning of a life reassembled by her own hands. The phone rang just as the late afternoon light began to tilt, gilding the edges of the city like an accidental frame. Amara had been hunched over the dining table, tracing a charcoal shadow on the amphitheater steps she had sketched the night before, when the ringtone, a simple, familiar chime, reached into the hush and asked to be heard. She hesitated for the barest second, fingers smudged with graphite, before lifting the phone. The screen showed a name she had not expected, Daniel Reyes. For a moment, the memory of him came forward, not as an image, but as a feeling. Steady, personable, the kind of warmth that arrives in a voice rather than a gesture. Daniel had been a client once, then a friend, then a collaborator in a small city renewal pilot where Amara had taught him how to read the grain of a neighborhood the way others read a ledger. Amara? His voice was immediate, the syllables rounded with a Puerto Rican cadence that had always made even the most mundane sentences sound intimate. "Are you home?" "Yes," she said, surprised at how small the word felt in her mouth. "How are you, Daniel?" "Better," he replied, "and busy, the good kind. Listen, I'll get straight to it. I'm building a new model of development, and I want you to lead the flagship project. Will you hear me out?" There was an invitation in the pause, not theatrical but earnest, the space a man makes when he is about to ask someone to trust him with something large. Amara's heart practiced a small, involuntary skip. She had been careful not to let hope take residence too quickly. Hope, after all, was a tenant that the heart had no way of evicting when it overstayed its welcome. Yet in Daniel's voice she heard possibility routing toward her like light finding a seam. "Tell me more," she said. Daniel spoke then with a clarity that felt like the snap of measured timbers coming together. He described a cultural complex in Washington, D.C., a reclaimed wood pavilion, community workshops, rooftop greenhouses, and public terraces oriented to catch the long southern light. But more than architecture, he spoke of intention. "We're trying to build an ecosystem," he said, "not a monument. A place that seeds local businesses, that teaches, that gives people tools to own a future. I want it to be led by someone who knows how to listen, not just to investors, but to neighborhoods. I want you." There was business language woven quietly into his sentences. Investors, timelines, zoning conversations, but the dominant thread was respect. Daniel referenced meetings Amara had joined years before, the way she had insisted on folding community voices into design, insisting that a plaza should not only be beautiful, but useful. He remembered the little design choices she had made that nobody else had ever noticed. The width of a bench so someone with shopping bags could sit without fear of toppling. The slope of a ramp that made elderly hands stable. He had noticed what others had missed. Amara let the words wash over her, and for a moment simply listened. There was a cautious joy in being recognized for the work itself, not the shadow of someone else's name appended to a press release, not the soft lifted credits under someone else's banner. Daniel offered authorship, and authorship felt like oxygen. "There will be challenges," Daniel said softly. "It's political. There's fundraising to secure, community boards that will test us, and yes, folks who still think the old ways work just fine. But I don't want a yes woman. I want a builder. I want you to be the voice that refuses compromises that would hollow the project out. The plainness of his request steadied her. He did not want a trophy. He wanted a partner in conviction. There was, woven into the stipulations, an implicit trust that sent something thawing through her chest. She imagined the Bronx sketches folded into a real parcel of land, the rain gardens catching more than water. They would catch stories and seed them into food, into markets, into new livelihoods. How soon? Amara asked, not from impatience but from a need to place the idea on the calendar of her life, to measure whether it could align with the rest of the small and urgent things she needed to stitch back together. Practical matters first, Daniel answered. Meet me in D.C. next week. I'll set up a site visit, then we'll bring the team together. We need someone to steward this conversation from day one. He paused, then added, I'm offering you the lead role, Amara. Not because of what happened, but because of what you can build. She found that she could not immediately say yes. There was the ghost of Ethan's last week still clinging to the corners of her days, and the memory of how it felt to watch another man stand where her name should have been. Yet Daniel's proposition came not as a generous handout, but as a professional gesture, a trust in competence rather than spectacle. It asked for risk, of course, and she had, for months, been practicing the small steps of courage that Naomi had recommended. This was a larger step, a leap of faith that required both skill and insistence. Give me a day to think, she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. I'll look at my portfolio, pull the documents together. If I can do it, Daniel, I will. Take the day, he replied, but we both know you'll be back on the drawing board tonight. His laugh was a small confirmation, like a familiar hinge catching. When you're ready, call me. We'll arrange travel and the meeting. She hung up and sat very still, the kitchen lights soft over her sketches. The phone was a small, heavy thing in her hand, charged now with an appointment she had not dared to write on calendars for months. It felt, in its own odd way, like a beginning. Naomi arrived an hour later with a thermos of strong coffee and a face set like a general's on the march. Upon hearing Daniel's name, she smiled. A smile that was not simply approval, but relief. Good, she said, taking the sketch Amara offered. It's time we let the world see your work again. On your terms. Amara watched Naomi read the drawing and felt a tide shift. The lines on the paper were the same, but now, under new light, they began to suggest movement rather than memory. She had been given a chance not only to design a building, but to reconstitute the terms of her own life. That night, she slept in short, strategic fits, and woke with a sense of purpose that felt almost like vertigo. It was not eradication of pain. The ache remained, a steady ledger of what had been taken. But beneath it, the pulse of possibility beat stronger. The call had not erased the aftermath. It had simply given it a direction. She unfolded her sketches once more and drew the first new line, not tentative this time, but decisive. The first morning Amara returned to her drafting table, the city seemed to hum with a different frequency, not louder, but clearer, like the static of her life had been tuned into coherence. The sky outside her apartment was washed in a pale silver light, a prelude to spring. Her hands trembled slightly as she unrolled the vellum sheet, pressing it flat beneath the gentle weight of a ceramic cup. It had been months since she'd drawn for something real, something that carried consequence beyond her own healing. The air smelled faintly of graphite, cedar, and the faint citrus of the oil she used to clean her tools, scents that belonged to another era of her life, before everything came undone. Yet as she stood there, pencil in hand, she realized that creation was the only language she had ever truly spoken fluently. The Bronx sketches lay beside her, ghosts of intention, and on the desk rested a new file Daniel had sent overnight, the DC Renewal Initiative. The project outline glowed softly on her laptop screen, a cultural complex built on the remnants of an abandoned bus depot in southeast DC, a place that had once carried lives in motion, but had long since become a husk of steel and concrete. As she studied the plans, she could already see what it wanted to be. Not an erasure of what stood there, but a transformation. The bones of the old depot could remain, repurposed into the skeleton of something alive. Her mind filled with the music of design, rhythm, repetition, counterpoint. She began to sketch. The first lines came slowly, hesitantly, like speech after silence. Then, once her hand remembered the tempo, the page filled with quick, assured strokes. She worked in charcoal at first. It allowed her to make mistakes, to blur and reshape. The outlines of a courtyard emerged, open to the sky, framed by green terraces that sloped gently into public seating. She imagined a marketplace on weekends, music in the air, a child chasing a red balloon across the flagstones. By mid-morning, her kitchen table was covered in sketches, fragments of perspective, snippets of light studies, quick notes scrawled in her slanted handwriting. Reuse rainwater channels, community roof gardens, public art collaboration. Naomi watched her from the doorway, a quiet smile playing on her lips. "It's good to see you like this again," she said. Amara looked up, eyes still bright with the trance of focus. "Like what?" "Like someone who remembers what she was born to do." Amara's pencil paused mid-air. For a moment, she let the compliment hang in the room like the scent of something delicate. "I don't know if I ever forgot," she said softly. "Maybe I just stopped believing it mattered." Naomi walked closer, her heels silent against the wood floor. "Then build something that reminds you why it does." And so she did. The next days blurred into a rhythm of purpose. Amara woke early, pulled her hair into a knot, and worked until twilight. She lived between paper and screen, hand-drawn sketches evolving into digital renderings, each version refining the one before it. Her laptop's glow became her companion, her tools scattered like relics across the table. She reimagined the site not as a monument but as an organism, a living, breathing structure woven from the city's own memory. The old steel beams of the depot would remain as a kind of historical vertebrae. Between them, she envisioned gardens, murals, and studios made from reclaimed shipping containers. Glass walls would open to the street, dissolving the boundary between inside and out there. At night, when exhaustion blurred her focus, she would step onto the balcony with a cup of tea and watch the city's reflection in the darkened river. Lights trembled like the pulse of 1,000 possibilities. Sometimes she thought of Ethan, not with pain now, but with distance, as if he were a city she had once lived in and left. Daniel called every few days, his voice steady and threaded with quiet excitement. He asked for updates but never hurried her. "You work in layers," he told her once. "That's what makes your spaces feel alive. Take your time." She appreciated his patience. It was the kind of respect she had rarely known in her collaborations. When she shared her early renderings with him over a video call, he listened intently, leaning forward, the glow of her drawings reflected in his eyes. When she finished, there was a long pause. "Amara," he said finally, "this feels like the kind of space that could change how a city breathes." The words landed softly, but they reverberated deep. It wasn't flattery, it was recognition. And recognition, she realized, was rarer and more intimate than love. In the quiet that followed, she returned to her work, guided by something both ancient and urgent, that particular hunger to make something that outlasts sorrow. She thought of the women before her, whose work had been archived under other men's names. She thought of Naomi, who fought her battles in courtrooms instead of blueprints. She thought of the little girl she had once been, drawing skylines in the margins of her school books. Every gesture of her hand now was a conversation with those ghosts, a promise to them all. By the end of the week, her apartment looked less like a home and more like an atelier. Rolls of tracing paper leaned against the wall. Sticky notes bloomed across her monitor like bright petals of intent. Her desk lamp cast a warm, amber glow across the room, illuminating the newest iteration of her design. A cross-section of the main hall, where the ceiling opened to a constellation of skylights. Amara stepped back to study it. Her throat tightened, not from sadness but from awe. It was beautiful. Not perfect, not yet, but undeniably alive. It carried her fingerprints, her rhythm, her choices. It carried her name, unapologetically signed in the corner. When she finally set her pencil down, dawn was creeping into the city again. The light pooled across her desk, touching the drawings as if in benediction. She closed her eyes for a long moment, breathing in the scent of paper and steel and graphite, the smell of creation, of rebirth. For the first time since Ethan had left, she did not feel like someone rebuilding from ruins. She felt like a woman who had never stopped building at all, only paused to remember her strength. And as she stood there, surrounded by her work, Amara understood what Naomi had meant that night. Motion is healing. Her motion was this: the sweep of her pencil, the soft drag of her ruler, the living sound of her own breath between each idea. She was no longer chasing what she had lost. She was drafting what would come next. The first ripple arrived like a piece of broken glass sliding across the table. Small, almost ordinary, then catching light and cutting. Amara found the article by accident, sent by a colleague with a line of concern. "Thought you should see this." The headline sat in her inbox like an accusation. Developer Ethan Caldwell reflects on change, says paths diverged. She opened it with the kind of steadiness she had been practicing. Breath in, breath out, only to feel the room tilt. Ethan's prose was practiced gentleness. He spoke of mutual growth and differences in priorities. And he told a calm, persuasive story, that he had encouraged Amara to pursue projects, that she had preferred the comforts of partnership, that the decision to part was an inevitable divergence rather than a choice he had made in secrecy. He framed himself as patient and generous. She became, in his telling, the one who chose quiet over consequence. It was an old trick. Submit the preferred narrative and wait for the city to take it as truth. People wanted tidy explanations. They wanted heroes and villains shaped to fit their sympathies. Ethan's version fit nicely into the well-worn mold of a man who had tried to save a partner from the chaos of ambition. It was a story with good lighting and clean lines, an image that would hang well in feeds and in polite conversation. Amara read the words twice, then a third time, as if repetition might reveal some hidden kindness. It did not. Instead, each sentence felt like a small erasure, a line crossed out in a ledger where her contributions should have been listed. He spoke of her as though she were a concept he had once tolerated, rather than a maker whose hands had helped order the city. He wrote of supporting her choices, of allowing space, and in those spaces, he had made himself the author. For a moment, anger flushed through her like heat through glass. It roared and then settled into a slow, concentrated burn. Memory assembled itself in the margins of the article. Late nights where her steady hand had corrected a structural miscalculation. The lakeside detail she had suggested that had become the project's signature. The penthouse staircase he'd taken credit for in an interview years ago. The constellations of small truths she had lived through now hung like a constellation someone else was trying to rename. Word moved fast. Daniel called first, his voice a steadying presence. "I read it," he said simply, "and I know you." There was no anxiousness in him, only that precise, practical steadiness that had always made him a good builder in both the literal and the humane sense. This will not be the story the neighborhood keeps, but stories are slippery. They live in people's mouths and shrivel or swell depending on how they are told. Ethan's narrative had the advantage of stage and polish. It would be picked up by feeds that favored sleek arcs over messy truths. She understood, with a cold clarity, that the danger was not only in what he said, but in the possibility that his lie might coagulate into accepted fact. She thought, at first, of rebuttal, a measured statement, a list of credits, a dry correction. Yet the thought tasted of a lesser light, like fixing the varnish on a bookshelf that had been carved by another hand. The architect in her wanted a different response, not a defensive post in the same frame he'd created, but a demonstration of the work itself. If Ethan wanted to tell a story about choices, she would answer by building a different kind of conviction, one that could not be edited away by a single byline. Still, the sting of being misread burned. It pulled at the old habit of silence, that mistaken courtesy she had practiced for years. She felt the old ghost of self-effacement, the reflex to smile and let others shape the narrative. This time, something bristled. She had been silent so long that her voice had grown calloused at the edges. Now, it felt raw and willing. That afternoon, she went to the site. The depot, gray and skeletal at first glance, was beginning to feel like the spine of the work. Steel beams rose, their flanges catching the sun like the teeth of an old comb. Workers moved with the precise choreography of people giving muscle to drawing. The air smelled of hot metal and sawdust, of concrete curing into permanence. Children from the neighboring block peered through the fencing, curious about the progress and the promise of a garden they might one day run through. The scene steadied her. She walked the footprint with Daniel at her side, boots crunching on gravel, a hard hat balanced on her palm, like a symbol she was relearning to wear. Daniel introduced her to the crew as the project's lead without parentheses, without the softening appendage of formerly associated with. The contractor nodded with a brief, practiced respect. The foreman handed over a set of updated plans, as if she had always been the one to read them. Ethan's name appeared in a flurry of messages, texts from past acquaintances, an ex-colleague's sympathetic but awkward reach, but he did not appear in person at the site that day. He had chosen the press for his assault, the veneer of 1,000 readers over the ineffable weight of a single steel column. Later, in the temporary office trailer, Amara closed the door and held the article in her hands again. She imagined the lines she would draw to rebut it. Not lines of text, but lines of roof over a courtyard where elders would teach and children would learn. She thought of the rain gardens she'd cited to catch not only runoff but also conversation. Of the workshop spaces that would be rented by women selling crafts whose stories had never been credited in their own neighborhoods. She saw, with the unromantic clarity of a designer, how each part of the project would serve as a quiet fact, an enduring testament to who had imagined it and for whom it was built. In the days that followed, Ethan tried softer maneuvers, subtle phone calls to investors, gentle suggestions that the market might prefer a different aesthetic, hints that the project's momentum would be easier to sustain with a seasoned team. These were not made as maliciously as his article. They came as whispers from a man who assumed that influence still followed his footsteps. But influence is not merely access, it is also recognition. And recognition must be earned and kept through stubborn presence. Amara answered not with a press release but with a schedule. Town hall meetings, a transparent budget plan, partnerships with local nonprofits, a roster of community liaisons who translated plans into the work of living. Each commitment was a response written in time and method, rather than in rebuttal. Yet, the ache remained. There were nights she reread her own notes, the margins of her early renderings where her handwriting curled with decision. She thought of the many ways a woman can be diminished without spectacle, through omission, through the careful retelling of a story in which the labor of her hands is footnoted and the narrative cast in the language of male benevolence. And still, beneath the flicker of indignation, a quieter music persisted. Each misstep Ethan took to rewrite history only sharpened her resolve. The city might love narratives that fit tidy frames, but built things have a stubborn specificity. A bench will either cradle someone's hip or it will not. A rain garden will either absorb water and teach stewardship or it will not. These facts, mute but enduring, can outlast the cleverest headline. So she continued to draw, to meet, to listen. She let the work be the reply. When the first shipment of reclaimed timber arrived at the site, she stood at the dock and watched men and women who could wield saw and nail, like words, shape the future into place. The beams smelled like history and possibility. They were rough-hewn and honest. They would remember the hands that fit them together. In time, narratives would shift again. People would begin to speak of the project because of the laughter that filled its courtyards, because of the markets that thrummed on weekend mornings, because a grandmother learned to teach a trade in a room that had been designed with her knees in mind. Ethan's article would be a single note in a larger chorus. The project's lived truth would be the song that lasted. For now, in the electric dusk, Amara watched the structure take form and felt, less like a woman proving herself, and more like someone finally returning to the work that made her whole. The blow had been sharp, the wound still tender, but against the rise of steel and timber, she could feel the slow, sure architecture of her own reclamation unfolding. The night Amara wrote the manifesto, the city outside her windows shimmered like a constellation made of glass and heartbeat. The hum of New York was low and steady, the kind of sound that made solitude feel deliberate. Her apartment was half-lit, the only illumination coming from her desk lamp, a single circle of gold spilling over scattered pages, rolled blueprints, and the faint ghost of graphite on her fingertips. For days, the article had followed her like an echo. Ethan's version of the truth rippling through industry networks, polite conversations, and think pieces written by people who had never built anything with their hands. His story had been neat, eloquent, mercifully shallow. It made him seem wise. It made her invisible. But invisibility had a weight she could no longer carry. So that night, after hours of pacing and half-formed sentences, Amara sat down and began to write, not to defend herself, but to articulate what she had always known, yet never said aloud. The first line arrived like a pulse. Architecture is not neutral. It remembers who was allowed to draw the first line and who was asked to stand quietly beside the model. Her pen moved faster than thought. She wrote about her years of quiet labor, the unspoken hierarchies in offices where her designs were praised until someone else signed them, where her ideas were softened for client comfort, where her presence was novelty until it became threat. She wrote about the beauty of women's work, how they designed for breath, for pause, for tenderness, qualities often dismissed as softness, but which, in truth, were strength in their purest form. She wrote about cities that swallowed women whole, about spaces where glass ceilings weren't metaphors, but architectural facts. And she wrote about rebuilding, not as vengeance, but as reclamation. Each paragraph felt like stone being set into place, a wall rising from the ruins. They told us to build like men, tall, cold, unyielding, and we did, for a while. But I have learned that the truest structures are the ones that breathe. They hold both sunlight and shadow. They are not monuments to ego. They are shelters for becoming. Outside, a siren wailed and faded into the distance. Amara paused, her pen hovering above the page. The words were coming too easily now, as if the voice that had been muted for a decade had been waiting for this moment of release. She continued, I used to think silence was grace, that restraint was the price of being taken seriously. But silence builds nothing. The world grows quieter when women stop naming the things they made. And what we don't name, someone else will claim. Her handwriting slanted and grew bolder, darker with each stroke. She described the Bronx Project, the one she had drawn in her 20s and returned to in her 30s, how the idea of it had outlived her heartbreak, how its shape had evolved from ambition into offering. She described the community meetings she'd begun hosting in D.C., the local artists who came carrying sketches, the single mother who said she wanted a place to sell her woven baskets without begging for permission. Design is not about perfection. It is about belonging. The mark of a good building is not applause. It is the echo of laughter inside its walls. When she finally looked up, the clock read 2:47 a.m. The page in front of her was dense, the ink glistening under the lamp like something alive. Her hand ached, her eyes burned, but there was a quiet clarity in her chest, the kind that arrives only after a truth has found its final form. She read the essay aloud, her voice trembling at first, then steadying. The Invisible Architects, she whispered, naming it almost unconsciously. In the morning, she sent it to a small digital publication known for amplifying women's voices in design. Blueprint Voices. She didn't expect much. Maybe a few readers, maybe a brief wave of solidarity that would fade in the next week's news cycle. She hit send and went to work. By noon, her inbox was a storm. The editor had published it immediately. Within hours, it had been shared across architecture networks, then social media, then national outlets. The essay traveled like wildfire, not because it was incendiary, but because it was true. Women in every corner of the industry began reposting it, adding their own stories, their own quiet griefs. A senior engineer in Chicago wrote, I cried at my desk. She said what I've swallowed for 20 years. A young designer in London quoted her line about silence, calling it, the blueprint I never had. The comments multiplied, filling with voices that had long been background noise in their own fields. Women who'd been rendered assistants in their own projects. Women who'd been told to smile through revisions that stripped away their fingerprints. Women who'd been applauded for grace under pressure, never for mastery. By evening, the essay was trending in professional forums and digital magazines. It wasn't rage that people heard in her words. It was relief. a quiet exhale from hundreds who realized they were not alone in their invisibility. Amara sat in her office at the DC site, reading the messages as they poured in. Her team, surprised at the surge of attention, began forwarding links, tagging her with congratulations. Daniel called, voice soft with pride. "You've started something," he said. "I only wrote what was already waiting to be said," she replied. He paused. That's what makes it powerful. When she finally stepped outside, dusk had begun to fall. The construction site glowed beneath floodlights, steel frames throwing long shadows against the ground. Workers moved like silhouettes inside a half-born cathedral of progress. She walked to the center of the courtyard, the one she designed to be open to the sky, and looked upward. The city's noise folded around her. Distant horns, laughter, the clatter of tools being set down for the night. For the first time, she felt the scale of what was forming. Not just the building, but the movement that had begun to build with it. Her manifesto had not been a cry of defiance. It had been an act of architecture and language, a structure made of truth and invitation. It offered space where silence had once been scaffolding. Somewhere far above her, the first evening stars pierced the pale wash of the city's light, and standing beneath them, Amara understood that she had not only built her voice, she had built a doorway. And through it, women were walking in. The day the storm came, the sky over the site bruised slowly from pewter into a deep, sullen indigo, and the city exhaled a long, damp breath. Rain began as a rumor, fine, restless. Not enough to stop work, only enough to send a silver sheen across the new steel and make the wooden pallets smell of wet earth. The depot's skeleton stood like a promise in the rain, open to the elements, honest in its incompleteness. Amara arrived with her hard hat tucked under her arm, hair pinned back, a raincoat folded over one shoulder. The weather did not deter her. If anything, the dimness clarified outlines she might otherwise have missed. Under the shelter of a temporary canopy, the foreman waved her over and handed her the newest set of shop drawings. The morning passed in careful negotiation. Concrete pours, rebar alignments, adjustments to the rain garden grating. Her rhythm was steady, the practiced music of someone whose hands had learned to speak in measurements and gestures. Then the air shifted. A black sedan rolled up onto the wet gravel, an image out of place against the chorus of work boots and hard hats. Ethan stepped out, collar turned up, hair damp from the rain. He was the exact kind of wrong the world could wear like a tailored coat. He moved toward them with that composure he had always treated as a kind of moral right, the same way a developer assumes the grid will bend to his plans. "Amara," he said before he had reached her, with an attempt at casual warmth that landed flat and rehearsed. She met him at the edge of the canopy, rain beating on her jacket. Beside her, Daniel watched with a discreet, protective stillness. Around them, the crew continued their work with the professional indifference of people accustomed to spectacle. "I didn't expect you here," Amara replied, the calm in her voice steady and not conciliatory. Ethan's smile sharpened. "I read your piece," he said, voice low enough not to be a performance but loud enough to be heard by a few. "You have a flair for the dramatic, Amara. Very modern." It was a compliment that clanged against the metal of the site, hollow. She folded her arms, feeling the wetness of her sleeves. "This job is not about drama. It's about people." He shook his head as if rehearsing a point. "You make it personal. That's the thing. You let everything become a manifesto. The city needs clarity, not rhetoric. There's a reason some of us think in terms of efficiency." The word was precise, like a blade. Daniel's jaw tightened. Before he could speak, Ethan stepped closer, the scent of his expensive cologne cutting through the rain's clean smell. "And frankly," Ethan went on, "your tower of principles might be nice for talk, but investors have concerns. They worry about temperament." His eyes flicked to the crew, to the stacks of reclaimed timber. "You risk the budget with theatrics." The accusation landed not as an abstract critique, but as a bid to undermine, to make the room doubt the woman steering their work. He tried the older trick, cast the maker as fragile, the visionary as impractical. It was a tactic as old as the first man who refused to share credit for a discovered river. Amara felt the familiar hot flare of indignation, but it did not swallow her whole. Instead, It concentrated into a narrow, luminous focus. She thought of the rain gardens she had insisted on, of the community workshops drawn into margins, of the single mother who had sketched a stall where she could sell hand-woven baskets. These were not grand gestures for a press release. They were small, stubborn acts of care. They were not spectacle. They were structure. Temperament, Amara said softly, but the steadiness in her voice made it a command. Ethan, this project is being built for people who live here, not for people who want to photograph it and call it their legacy. If investors worry, we talk to them. If they walk away, that is their choice. But we will not compromise the work because someone prefers the version of the city that looks clean in a portfolio. Around them, a few workers slowed, listening. Daniel placed a hand near the set of drawings like a sentinel, supportive, patient. Ethan's mouth tightened. This was not the docile response he had expected. "You always were dramatic," he said, voice colder now. "You always felt things too fiercely. Maybe that's what made you good in the studio, but it makes you unreliable on a ledger." Amara's laugh was a small, controlled thing, half surprise, half disbelief. So the measure of a person is how well they fit in the margins others give them. "Sometimes pragmatism," he began. "No," she interrupted. "Pragmatism without justice is timidity. This site asks for responsibility, not the kind that keeps accounts tidy, but the kind that keeps lives intact." For a moment, the rain seemed to listen, the soft percussion filling down the edges of the exchange. Ethan looked at her then, with something that had the shape of recognition, but stripped of entitlement, the odd, disquieting comprehension that the woman before him had not been diminished by his leaving, that her practice did not begin or end with his approval. The wind tugged at his collar like a small admonition. He opened his mouth as if to say more, but his lines faltered. The script he had relied upon, elegant dismissal, calibrated condescension, was failing in the face of Amara's exactness and steadiness. He had practiced erasure like a craft. She had practiced making. The exchange ended, not with a melodramatic collapse, but with a quieter thing. Ethan stepping back, taking the measure of the space as if it were no longer wholly his to read. He turned toward his car and left, the sound of the engine folding into the rain. The crew resumed their rhythm. Daniel drew Amara close for a quiet moment, the gesture protective rather than possessive. She allowed herself a single exhale, the kind that shakes loose an ache held too long. The storm, which had threatened ruin, had instead washed the site clean. Rain drummed the beams and ran in bright veins across the newly laid timber. Where thunder had been possible, there was only water, clear, honest, and relentless enough to reveal foundations. Amara returned to the drawings, letting her hands find the lines once more. In the space that had been charged by accusation, she felt a new quiet ferocity. Not the brittle fire of revenge, but the steady, warming blaze that transforms raw timber into beams that can carry weight. It would take time, and weather, and endurance. But under the rain and the sky and the slow, sure work of her hands, the building kept rising, and with it, the truth of who had imagined it. The manifesto had opened a door, and through it poured a slow, luminous current whose edges caught like light on water. What began as a single essay became a chorus. Op-eds, podcasts, midnight threads where women shared the small violences and the quiet triumphs that had long been held in private. The phrase, "invisible architects," moved from headline into vernacular, a way to name what had not been named, and with a name came solidarity. Amara watched the movement grow not from the seat of spectacle, but from rooms that smelled of coffee and possibility. She found herself invited to speak in places she had once assumed were closed to her. A university studio crit where her students listened with the reverence of those who finally heard a permission granted. A radio segment with a host who leaned forward and asked questions that mattered. A panel of women designers convened in a glass lecture hall where sunlight pooled like applause. Her voice, when it rose, had the calm, exact cadence of someone who had recommitted herself to truth. At the first public forum that carried her essay spirit into conversation, the room was full of younger faces, early career designers with sketchbooks under their arms, a smattering of seasoned practitioners whose hands had weathered projects and prejudice alike, and community organizers who measured impact in the rhythms of neighborhoods, rather than in glossy renderings. A woman in the front row, no more than 25, held up a trembling hand and asked how she could demand credit in a firm that insisted on patriarchal authorship. Amara answered with the particular tenderness of someone who had once learned to shrink. She told stories of small, strategic insistences, of emailing annotated drawings with timestamps, of cultivating allies who could corroborate contributions. Her counsel was practical, fierce, and strangely freeing. The movement found shape in organized forms. Pop-up mentorships sprang up in disused storefronts, where older women taught the younger how to write proposals and how to stand at the lectern without apologizing for breathing. A podcast series took Amara's essay as its first season arc, interviewing women architects from varying geographies who recounted the moment their work had been claimed by someone near them. There were panels, sometimes rowdy, sometimes tender, where industry leaders were forced to listen as women named the mechanics of erasure. Funders began to ask different questions, not only about projected returns but about equitable credit and community stewardship. The changes were not overnight, but they were concrete, and the architecture of the industry began to feel at last slightly less monolithic. On the DC site, the flux translated into bodies and practices. Young designers from historically marginalized neighborhoods began to show up for unpaid internships that had, until then, been gatekept by pedigrees and privileges. Amara insisted on pay, on community liaisons who could translate plans into practice, on partnerships with local trade schools that trained carpenters and artisans. She made room, literally and figuratively, for those whose names had never made it into journals. Where there had been tokenism, she demanded continuity. Where there had been one-off gestures, she fostered pipelines. There was joy in the practical details. The morning, a cohort of high school students painted a mural on the temporary hoarding, laughing as they argued over color palettes. The afternoon, a grandmother taught a dozen young interns the technique of basket weaving, her hands moving like history. The night, community leaders and residents watched a projected rendering and pointed to the bench where they imagined birthday cakes and language classes. These small moments stitched the project into the neighborhood's fabric. The building ceased to be a singular object and became a locus of becoming. With visibility came attention, and not all of it welcome. Critics sharpened their pens, questioning costs, aesthetic choices, and the very premise of centering marginalized voices in design. There were those who accused the movement of politicizing practice. Others charged that the attention on credit distracted from craft. Amara felt the pressure like a tide. Sometimes it made her braver, sometimes it left her trembling. She learned to moderate her public presence, to let others speak when her voice might eclipse them, to use prominence as a stage for many rather than an arena for self. She also learned the delicate art of mentorship. Young women arrived with fierce intelligence and fragile confidence. Some needed advice, some needed passports to the rooms that had historically excluded them. Amara spent long evenings reviewing portfolios, writing recommendation letters, and sitting across from protégés who asked exactly the questions she had once swallowed. In those sessions, she found a peculiar delight, an expansion of purpose that felt like a widening of the skyline itself. Naomi watched with a sister's steady pride, noting how the movement's practical advancements had a quality she recognized from her own courtroom work. The slow accrual of precedents that, over time, tilt institutions toward justice. "You're not just building a building," Naomi said once, standing beside the newly sown rain garden. "You're building a new expectation." Daniel, who had been Amara's collaborator in practical ways from the start, began forging partnerships that ensured the movement's momentum translated into enduring structures. Grants that required equitable authorship clauses, contractor agreements that codified apprenticeships, community stewardship endowments that would fund programming for years beyond the ribbon cutting. His quiet competence relieved some of the logistical burdens, allowing Amara to remain, in many rooms, both fierce and focused. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Amara walked the unfinished courtyards alone. The scaffolding cast long, intricate shadows like lace. In the hush, she could almost hear the future, the echo of footsteps along paths she had cited for conversation, the murmur of a market beneath a canopy, designed to shelter both weather and exchange. The movement had changed the tenor of her work. There was now a sense that each design choice might ripple beyond the bounds of a single project and into the culture of practice itself. As the project rose, so did a constellation of smaller efforts across the city. Initiatives that borrowed Amara's insistence on authorship and attention, reimagining how teams credited work and how buildings acknowledged their makers. The phrase, invisible architects, became not only an elegy but a blueprint, a map for insisting on the visible record of labor. In studios, in classrooms, in the offices of developers who had once been indifferent, conversations shifted. It was, as Naomi had said, the slow accrual of precedent. Amara felt the weight of responsibility settle like a warm coat. Leadership, she had learned, was not only about answering the loudest calls, but about passing the microphone. The movement was not hers alone. It belonged to the many voices it had given room to speak. In that widening, she found a tenderness deeper than applause, the quiet satisfaction of seeing names appear where they had long been missing, of watching those she mentored step into rooms without apology. Under the scaffolding in the sky, the work continued, measured in more than drafts and dollars. It measured in confidence rebuilt, in practices altered, in the steady, polite revolution of how a city remembers who made it. And as the sun lowered each day, casting long amber bars across the unfinished faces of the building, Amara often paused to watch the light settle where benches would be, where stories would start, and knew that the movement she had helped ignite was, in fact, simply the city remembering itself anew. The invitation arrived on thick ivory paper, its embossed lettering shimmering faintly in the afternoon light. The National Architecture Foundation Gala. The event was set to be held at the Astoria Grand, the same marbled hall where, years before, Amara had stood behind Ethan while he received an award for a project they had designed together. That night, she had been introduced as his inspiration, not his partner. Now her own name sat at the top of the list. Keynote speaker, Amara Bennett, founder of the Renewal Collective. She read it twice, not with disbelief but with a quiet, measured recognition. The wheel had turned. The woman who had once drafted in the shadows was now being invited into the light, not as someone's extension, but as her own full geometry. Still, the past hummed faintly beneath the moment, like static before a song. Naomi noticed it as she helped Amara fasten her earrings on the evening of the gala. "You look like you're about to present a verdict," she said with a grin. "In a way, I am." The gown Amara had chosen was deep cobalt, the color of twilight and endurance. The fabric moved like water when she walked, structured yet fluid. An architect's dress, precise in its seams, graceful in its fall. Her hair was swept into a low twist, exposing her neck like the clean line of a column. There was no adornment beyond a pair of small gold hoops, a deliberate simplicity. "You don't need armor," Naomi said, smoothing a strand of hair. "You've already won." "I'm not going to win," Amara replied. "I'm going to speak." The car carried her through the bright veins of the city, the skyline rising like a chorus of glass and will. When she arrived, the Astoria Grand was radiant. Chandeliers dripped light, guests shimmered in silk and tailored black. The air hummed with the familiar cocktail of ambition and admiration, that elegant tension found only in rooms built to celebrate themselves. The moment she entered, conversations tilted, faces turned, some warm, some wary, all attentive. The crowd had shifted since the last time she'd been here. New names, new energies, though the same old hierarchies lingered in subtle patterns. Daniel was already inside, speaking with a journalist. He caught her eye and smiled, a calm, grounding gesture that steadied her pulse. Across the room, Naomi lifted her glass in silent salute. And then, like a ghost stepping through a doorway he no longer owned, Ethan Caldwell appeared. He was older, though not by much. The difference was in the details, the faint slackness around the eyes, the kind of fatigue that comes from maintaining a narrative too long. His suit was immaculate, his posture as rehearsed as ever. Chloe trailed behind him, still beautiful, still poised, though there was a nervous precision to her movements, as if she had begun to sense the fragility of the pedestal she stood on. Amara didn't flinch. She met his gaze briefly, a glance devoid of malice or nostalgia. It was simply recognition, a nod to a past that no longer required tending. When the program began, she sat near the front with Daniel and Naomi. The foundation president spoke of innovation, of social responsibility in architecture, of how design could shape culture. Then, in a sweep of applause, he announced her name. Amara rose. The room quieted. She crossed the stage with a poise that felt both deliberate and effortless. Her heels clicked softly against the polished floor, an echo of rhythm, each step measured, as if she were walking across the bridge she herself had built. The podium light cast a soft halo on her face. She began slowly, not reading from her notes, but speaking as one who has long since internalized her purpose. "When I was a young architect," she said, her voice even and resonant, "I thought the most powerful thing I could do was design a skyline. I believed that beauty was a matter of scale, that the higher we built, the greater our contribution. But cities have taught me otherwise. True architecture doesn't rise above people, it rises from them." Her gaze swept the audience, calm and direct. "I've spent years in rooms where my work spoke louder than my name," she continued. "And I've learned that silence, when repeated long enough, becomes architecture too, a structure that traps rather than shelters. But I've also learned that we can rebuild. We can tear down what silences us and build anew, together, with honesty and humility as our foundation." Somewhere near the back, she saw Ethan shift in his seat, his face unreadable. Chloe stared forward, hands clasped too tightly in her lap. Amara went on, the rhythm of her words as architectural as her designs. Each sentence a beam, each pause a window. "The Renewal Collective was founded not out of anger, but out of love. Love for the act of making, love for the cities that hold our histories, and love for the invisible architects who have shaped our world without acknowledgement. Tonight's award is not mine alone. It belongs to every woman who has ever drawn in the margins and dared to call it design." Her voice softened then, deepening into something luminous. "Architecture, at its heart, is not about permanence. It's about trust, the faith that someone will live inside what you build, that your lines will hold their laughter and their grief. And sometimes when life dismantles everything we've built, trust is what allows us to rebuild ourselves." A stillness fell over the room. It wasn't polite attention. It was reverence, the kind that comes when truth replaces spectacle. When she stepped away from the podium, the applause rose slowly, then gathered force until it filled the hall like a tide. Naomi was the first to stand. Daniel followed. One by one, others rose too, until the entire room stood, the sound swelling until it seemed to vibrate through the chandeliers. Amara bowed her head, not in triumph, but in gratitude. As she descended the stage, she caught Ethan's eyes once more. For the first time, he looked uncertain. Not defeated, but disoriented, as though he were seeing her for the first time without the filter of his own reflection. He mouthed her name, perhaps to call out, perhaps to apologize, but the applause drowned whatever words might have followed. Naomi met her halfway down the aisle, radiant with pride. Daniel extended his hand, his smile steady, anchoring. The night continued in a blur of congratulations, photographs, and champagne. Yet through it all, Amara remained calm, her joy tempered by the deeper serenity of closure. The room that had once made her small now seemed vast, breathable. Outside, the city pulsed beneath the winter sky, the lights of Manhattan glinting against a veil of mist. Amara stepped into the cold, her coat folded over her arm. For a moment, she stood there in the hush that follows applause, letting the air fill her lungs. The skyline stretched before her, luminous, flawed, enduring. It was no longer something she looked up to. It was something she stood within. And for the first time, she felt entirely, magnificently home. The days after the gala unfolded like a slow unrolling of a ribbon, careful, deliberate, threaded with light. Recognition, Amara discovered, did not arrive as a single, blinding star, but as many small confirmations. Emails that read like handshakes, phone calls that carried warmth instead of calculation, conversations that moved beyond curiosity into commitment. The architecture journals ran features that felt less like portraiture and more like testimony. Photographers asked to return to the site to capture the timber beams, the rain gardens, the arches where sunlight pooled like promise. Editors wanted long-form essays about process and place. They asked her about decisions she had kept quiet for years. Why the amphitheater's steps were shallow. Why the market stalls sat beneath a particular overhang. When she answered, she found herself telling stories not only about materials but about people. The grandmother who taught weaving. The teenagers who wanted a place to build speakers and try songs for the first time. The organizers who insisted on hosting voter registration drives beneath the pergola. Each anecdote became a kind of validation. The project's worth measured in lives touched, not merely in columns or cubic meters. Investors, once cautious, began to show a different posture. Those wary of social programming recognized now that community engagement translated into durability. A space that people used willingly resisted obsolescence in a way trophies did not. Meetings shifted from skepticism to collaboration. Funders came not merely to judge, but to listen, to ask how their capital might hold longer-term stewardship, how they might underwrite apprenticeship programs rather than just facades. Daniel negotiated with a patient, quiet force that complemented her vision. Together, they turned attention into contracts that would secure not only construction, but a season of programs after the ribbon cutting. On the site, the changes were even more intimate. A carpenter who had apprenticed in a shop where names were rarely written in any ledger now had his work photographed and credited in an online portfolio. A teenage apprentice from the local trade school received her first paid internship as part of the construction crew. She sent Amara a photograph of herself on a scaffold, grinning, teeth white against the afternoon sun. Those images circulated among people who mattered to her in a way no press clipping could. Recognition became a ripple that reached down into the labor of hands, restoring small dignities. The city's cultural institutions took notice as well. A museum invited her to curate a small exhibition about community-led design. A university asked her to give a guest lecture and to sit on a panel on equitable development. Each invitation was an instrument of validation, not only for her but for the many people whose names now began to appear where they once had been footnotes. In the lecture halls, students sat forward in their seats, sketchbooks open in laps, as if what she described might be a map they could follow. The public's attention felt different from the personal attention she had known before. It was wider, softer, more enacting than performative. Neighbors brought pies and painted signs. Community organizers sent letters of thanks that folded the project into the city's lived story. When the site hosted its first weekend market, the laughter that rose from among the stalls was a kind of chorus that affirmed what she had always believed. Architecture's truest metric is the life it allows to flourish inside it. Even Ethan's orbit shifted. His name surfaced occasionally in boardroom murmurs and sympathetic calls. An old friend from a developer's forum checking in, an investor trying to broker introductions. He watched from a distance as the city began to associate the project with her signature rather than his shadow. There were moments when their trajectories crossed in the most ordinary places. A mutual acquaintances event, an industry roundtable. Each meeting was a reminder of how narratives could bend when the facts of work, of authorship, accumulated into stubborn evidence. Yet recognition did not erase the ache of the past. It softened it, made it more like a learned scar than a keening wound. Amara found herself thinking often of the young black women who had written to her after the manifesto, their emails candid and raw, asking how they might hold themselves in rooms that were not built for them. She began to imagine the arc of her influence as a ladder rather than a podium, something to climb and to hand down. Her team felt the change tangibly. Where once interns had hesitated to correct a veteran, now junior designers raised hands in meetings with sketches and solutions. Amara made a practice of crediting those voices in public forums, of ensuring that when a render was posted online, it carried with it a roster of names, carpenters, liaisons, community advisors. It was a small ritual, perhaps, but rituals are the scaffolding of culture. Recognition, she learned, came with responsibility. The city had given her a larger platform, and platforms, like plazas, gathered people. She found herself stewarding difficult conversations about gentrification anxieties, about how to keep rents affordable in the shadow of a celebrated building, about who benefited when a neighborhood's skyline rose. The questions were complicated, and the answers often incomplete, but she welcomed the complexity because it meant the work was no longer merely aesthetic. It had become civic. One morning, as the frame of the building rose against a sky scraped clean by wind, a letter arrived from the mayor's office. It was warm and formal, a civic nod that named the project as emblematic of a new model for public-private partnership. Such letters could be ceremonial, but this one carried an invitation to collaborate on a citywide initiative focused on resilient infrastructure in marginalized neighborhoods. The acknowledgement felt like a bridge, a municipal recognition that private ambition and public good could be braided together. Amara read the letter sitting at the site's temporary office, the papers under her palm smelling faintly of sawdust and printer ink. Outside, a child chased a dog across the lot where, months from now, a garden would bloom. Naomi sat across from her, coffee cooling in a paper cup, and smiled in a way that held both pride and a sister's quiet consternation at the emotional labor their work demanded. "You did this," Naomi said simply. "We did," Amara corrected, and in the correction lived the movement's true achievement. It was not solely her name in lights, but the chorus of many voices, designers, builders, neighbors, students, that had insisted on being seen. As recognition piled into schedules and press, Amara held to a practice she had learned from long nights with tracing paper. To look at what she was making inch by inch, to measure success not only in headlines, but in benches that bore the weight of bodies, in programs that persisted after the cameras left. She kept a small stack of letters from residents in her drawer, notes from grandparents who used the hall to teach, from teenagers who made their first recorded song in the studio, from a mother who said the marketplace had changed how she fed her family. Those pages, more than any award, were the ledger she returned to when accolades felt distant. Recognition, then, was not an endpoint, but a new starting point, an invitation to sustain, to deepen, to hand the microphone over as often as she took it up. In the light that moved across the timber and glass each morning, Amara saw the reflection of many hands, and she felt, quietly and inexorably, that the city was finally learning to name what it had been built by. It began not with confrontation, but with an email. A single, sterile message that arrived on a quiet Monday morning. The kind of day when the air outside felt heavy with stillness, and even the city seemed to move more slowly. Ethan's name appeared in the sender line. Amara had not heard from him directly since the gala. There had been sidelong glances at conferences, professional pleasantries mediated through mutual contacts, a fragile truce of avoidance. But this email, stripped of pleasantries, carried the precision of a final gambit. "Amara, I'd like to propose a partnership, a redevelopment proposal for the East River Front. The city wants innovation and authenticity. Your movement has both. My firm has the capital and reach. We could merge strengths. For the public good, of course. Think about it. E. See, there it was again, that soft arrogance masquerading as generosity. For a long moment, Amara simply stared at the screen. A pulse began to rise in her throat, not of anger, but of clarity. He didn't understand, or perhaps he did, and this was his way of reclaiming what the world had quietly taken from him. Relevance, legitimacy, the illusion of benevolence. She closed the email without replying, but silence, once chosen, has its own echo. 2 days later, her assistant entered the office with a worried look and a newspaper folded beneath her arm. The headline was blunt. Caldwell Group announces East River Renewal Initiative, a vision of inclusive design. Below it, a photo of Ethan, polished and confident, standing beside renderings that bore a disturbing familiarity. The design language, the curves, the use of local materials, even the phrasing of the mission statement, was unmistakably hers. Her manifesto, distilled into a corporate slogan, the words blurred as she read. A vision of belonging, architecture as reclamation. It was theft, elegant, precise theft. Not of form, but of spirit. Naomi was the first to speak when Amara showed her the article. He's using your language, the same metaphors, even the community phrasing. He's building your idea and pretending it's collaboration. Daniel's reaction was quieter, steadier. Then it's time to decide if you'll fight him in court or in conscience. The days that followed were a storm of meetings, calls, and press inquiries. Reporters sought her comment. Allies urged her to release a statement. "It's plagiarism," one journalist said bluntly. "We can expose it." But Amara hesitated. What she saw in Ethan's mimicry wasn't merely theft. It was fear disguised as ambition. If she turned this into a battle, the headlines would devour nuance. Her story would become their spectacle again. The feuding architects. Instead, she chose precision. That night, under the quiet hum of her apartment, she opened a new document. The cursor blinked like a heartbeat at the top of the page. She titled it, "The Ethics of Authorship, When Innovation Becomes Imitation." She wrote slowly, meticulously, crafting each sentence not as accusation but as inquiry. She spoke of how easily movements are co-opted when they begin to succeed, how language built from pain and purpose can be polished into slogans that sell. She didn't mention Ethan's name once. She didn't need to. The industry would read between the lines. When the essay went live 3 days later, it spread like a quiet storm. Publications quoted it, professors assigned it, panels debated it. It became less a rebuttal than a mirror, reflecting the uneasy truth of an industry too quick to consume what it pretended to celebrate. Ethan's firm issued a vague statement about shared inspiration. It fooled no one. Within weeks, 2 major sponsors quietly withdrew from his East River project. The city, sensing controversy, paused the approval process. And for the first time, Amara saw the man she had once admired begin to unravel publicly. He showed up unannounced one evening at the DC site. As the last rays of sunset bled over the steel and glass, the crew had gone home. Only Amara and Daniel remained, reviewing final revisions under the humming lights. Ethan stood at the edge of the courtyard, raincoat damp, eyes shadowed. "You've turned them against me," he said, voice tight. "You couldn't let me have one thing." Amara didn't rise from her chair. "You never wanted one thing, Ethan. You wanted everything. You think you're better than me now," he said. "You think you invented morality." "No," she replied quietly, "but I learned the difference between creation and control. You used to know it too." For a heartbeat, he looked as though he might say something else, perhaps the truth, perhaps the apology that had died too many times on his tongue. Instead, he turned, muttering something about futures and mistakes, and disappeared into the deepening night. Daniel watched him go, his expression unreadable. When the echo of footsteps faded, he spoke softly. "He's not the storm anymore, Amara. Just the weather passing through." The words lingered long after Ethan was gone. In the weeks that followed, silence returned. Not the heavy kind of old, but a gentler quiet, the aftermath of something resolved. Her team continued their work, unshaken. The building rose higher, its facade beginning to reflect the changing sky, as if even the structure itself had learned resilience. Recognition still arrived, interviews, awards, proposals, but Amara accepted them differently now. She had stopped chasing light, she had become it. And yet, one evening, as she walked alone through the half-finished atrium, she paused beneath the vast skylight and tilted her face upward. The glass was streaked with the last drops of rain, the city's pulse visible beyond it. For a long while she stood there, listening to the faint murmur of wind threading through the beams. It was then she realized what the final break truly was. Not with Ethan, not even with the industry, but with the version of herself that had once needed to be seen through someone else's eyes. That version was gone now. In her place stood a woman who had built, lost, rebuilt, and risen again. Not in defiance, but in devotion. Outside, thunder rolled low and distant, a sound less like threat and more like affirmation. And as the city lights flickered across the glass above her, Amara exhaled, long, sure, and unafraid. Morning came quietly to the city, soft and gold, as if the world itself had paused to take a long, contented breath. The new building stood complete now, not as a monument, but as a promise. Its facade caught the first light of dawn and scattered it across the streets below. where children's laughter mixed with the low murmur of buses and bicycles. The city was awake, alive, and for the first time in years, Amara felt it breathe with her. The official opening of the Renewal Collective Center was scheduled for that afternoon, but Amara arrived long before the speeches and the crowds, before the music, before the cameras. She wanted to see it alone first, to meet her creation in silence, as one might greet a long-lost friend. The entrance was still fragrant with cedar, the air cool with the faint metallic tang of morning dew on glass. As she stepped inside, the light shifted through the atrium like a living thing, threading itself across the polished stone and warm timber beams. She paused near the center of the space, where sunlight poured through the skylight she had fought so hard to preserve, the one everyone said was unnecessary. Now, standing beneath it, she could see the dust motes floating like tiny stars. The ceiling framed a square of sky, endlessly open. It was perfect. Not flawless, but perfect. Her fingertips brushed along the nearest column. Each one bore the engraved names of builders, designers, and community members who had contributed, not just architects, but carpenters, metalworkers, and residents. The names spiraled upward, creating a literal pillar of recognition. Her name was among them, yes, but not at the top. It sat near the middle, nested among dozens of others. She had insisted on that. Daniel's footsteps echoed softly behind her. "You always come early," he said. She turned and smiled. "I like to see what the light does when no one's watching." He nodded, slipping his hands into his pockets. The years between them had softened into an easy companionship, one built not from romance alone, but from respect and shared endurance. The way he looked at her now wasn't with the hunger of the beginning, but with the peace of someone who had seen her become everything she was meant to be. Naomi joined them moments later, her heels clicking like punctuation on the polished floor. "They're setting up outside," she said. "You're about to be mobbed by reporters again." Amara laughed quietly. "Let them. This isn't about me anymore." Outside, the plaza filled with people, hundreds of them. Students, residents, activists, journalists, city leaders. Children ran ahead of their parents, tracing small circles on the mosaic courtyard. Murals painted by local artists wrapped around the lower walls, telling the story of the community's rebirth, the way architecture and humanity had learned, at last, to share the same heartbeat. When the ceremony began, Amara stepped to the podium. The microphone hummed, catching the slight tremor in her breath. The crowd fell still. "Years ago," she began, her voice warm but sure, "I believed architecture was about permanence, about building something that could outlast time. But this project has taught me that the truest structures are not the ones that resist change. They are the ones that invite it." She paused, letting the silence gather. "This building belongs to everyone here, to those who designed, who labored, who believed. Every beam carries a story. Every stone remembers a name. What we've built is not just a structure, it's a declaration. That inclusion is not decoration, that recognition is not charity, and that community is not an afterthought. It's the blueprint of our future." The wind caught her words, lifting them toward the glass and sky. Naomi stood at the front row, eyes bright with pride. Daniel's hand brushed the edge of the podium briefly, grounding her, reminding her that she was not alone. "And now," Amara said softly, "we begin again. Not from the ruins of what was taken, but from the foundations we've laid together." The ribbon was cut. Applause rose, slow, reverent, then swelling into something jubilant. Music began, a local gospel choir that filled the plaza with sound as bright as sunlight. Children rushed inside, their footsteps echoing across the atrium. Somewhere above them, the skylight poured gold across their faces, making every laugh shimmer. Amara stepped back, watching. Her throat tightened, not with sorrow but with gratitude. Later, when the crowd thinned, she climbed to the rooftop terrace. The city stretched out before her, vast and shimmering. Glass towers catching the day, rivers glinting like threads of silver. She had walked these streets as a dreamer once, unseen and uncertain. Now she saw the skyline anew. It wasn't that she had changed the city. It was that she had revealed what had always been there. The quiet power of hands, the resilience of those who refused to remain invisible, the collective art of becoming. The new skyline was not higher, it was wider, more open, more human. She leaned on the railing, the wind teasing the hem of her jacket. Down below, a group of children pointed at the building and shouted her name. She waved, laughing, then watched as they darted toward the mural that bore the words she had once written in solitude. What we build together cannot be erased. Her eyes softened. For a long moment, she stood there, framed by the wind and the light, her silhouette part of the skyline she had helped shape. The skyline didn't belong to power anymore. It belonged to the people, to their stories, their courage, their hands. She turned to Daniel and Naomi, who had joined her on the roof. "Do you hear that?" she asked, tilting her head toward the hum below. Naomi smiled. "That's the sound of something beginning." Amara nodded. "No," she whispered, her gaze sweeping the horizon. "That's the sound of something becoming." The sun climbed higher, flooding the rooftop in light. And in that brightness, the warmth of completion, of redemption, of legacy, she felt the simple, sacred truth of her journey settle into place. That love and purpose, when built with care, can outlast anything. She turned back to the city, her voice barely above a murmur, yet carried by the wind like a promise. Let's keep building. If this story touched you, if you felt her journey, her strength, her heart, share it. Let others hear it too. Like, comment, and follow to keep her spirit alive. And together, let's keep building the stories that make us believe again.